Hello and welcome to Rising. We've got another excellent show for you today, including a number of really good interviews, including one right now at the top of the show. So let's get to our first story. WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange was greeted with cheers in Australia as he stepped off the plane in Canberra, Australia, the country where he grew up. This comes after an extraordinary journey of 14 years, which took him from hiding in the Ecuadorian embassy to prison in London and finally home. Now, just hours earlier in the U.S. territory of the Mariana Islands, Assange pleaded guilty to one felony charge of violating the U.S. Espionage Act and was sentenced to time served. In 2010, WikiLeaks released files relating to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Assange appeared with his lawyer, Jennifer Robinson, and the Australian ambassador to the U.S., Kevin Rudd, in a courtroom in the Northern Mariana Islands in the West Pacific.
The deal allows Assange to return to a life of freedom after spending 5 years behind bars in British custody. His freedom, however, came at a cost. The flight back to Australia cost $520,000, a price Assange will have to repay to the Australian government. His wife, Stella, wrote on X, emergency appeal for donations to cover massive US dollars 520,000 debt for jet. Julian's travel to freedom comes at a massive cost. Julian will owe $520,000, which he is obligated to pay back to the Australian government for a charter flight, VJ199. He was not permitted to fly commercial airlines or routes to Saipan and onward to Australia. Any contribution, big or small, is much appreciated. Joining us now to discuss is Julian Assange's brother, Gabriel Shipton. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, good to be with you again.
So help us understand, this flight. I think a lot of people saw this and they were like, how could a flight possibly be this expensive? What is this money for? Can you help us understand why this cost is so high?
Well, it was a special flight for Julian to take him from Stansted Airport in London via Bangkok. They had to stop and refuel in Bangkok. And then they had to stop in that island you mentioned, in the Mariana Islands, Saipan. And on that island, it's the closest US jurisdiction to Australia. And so when Julian arrived on that island, he took his guilty plea, before a judge on that island. And that judge accepted that guilty plea and sentenced Julian to time served. So he could then walk out of that court a free man. But these lengthy stopovers and complicated route, I suppose, led to the inflated cost of this flight. Interestingly, the flight tracker was for a small period of time, was the most tracked flight on the planet. It for a very short amount of time, eclipsed Taylor Swift's jet, which is the most tracked jet on the planet. So the amount of interest in Julian's freedom and his trek across the globe back to Australia, where he is now safe and sound, as you see in that video footage, was closely watched by many thousands of people around the world.
Describe to us his mental state, his mood. I mean, how is he doing right now? He must be quite elated to finally be free. What is going through his head? Have you had much contact with him yet?
I've had a couple of texts while he was on the flight. I was speaking to him every day in the lead up to when he was going to get on the jet, as the details were falling into place. I was talking to him, about how he would get to the airport. They actually snuck him out of prison very, very early in the morning. The UK authorities not wanting his transfer to be leaked to the media as long as possible. So all these little details that he was sharing with me, even up until the evening when he left the prison. But he was very excited, obviously a little bit anxious because there was those little bits that needed to be done in the US jurisdiction, but very excited to be out, talking about what he'd do when he got home, going for a swim in the ocean, listening to the Australian bird life, and just been with his family and been with his two small children who have never known Julian outside a maximum security prison. So today is a really special day, Robbie, for us. I know I've been on this show many, many times, and I want to thank you for all the efforts that you guys put in keeping this issue alive and educating the public on this issue, because it's platforms and channels like yours that really make a difference to people's knowledge of this case.
We appreciate that, and we feel very strongly, very passionately about freedom of speech, about press freedoms, and we only thought that more people should have been speaking up consistently in this clear violation of very core principles to the United States. Do you know more about what motivated the deal falling into place right now? Obviously, maybe it's just speculation, but Donald Trump had said something about Assange when pressed at the Libertarian National Convention gathering. The Libertarians have been pretty vocal about wanting Assange to go free. Did this issue finally get before Joe Biden, and did he say, why are we still continuing this? Was it just, the gears, the wheels of justice, finally turning and having this result? Do you have any idea why now this is happening?
Well, look, it's a number of things. This has been a very lengthy campaign, as you know, and there's been millions of grassroots activists working around the world on this, particularly in Australia. The Australian government has been advocating for Julian and were really key in this negotiation, this diplomatic negotiation to get Julian out of the prison and back to Australia. There was a High Court hearing scheduled for the 9th and 10th of July. Coming up in the UK courts, and that was a full appeal that Julian had been awarded, and it was strictly on the freedom of expression grounds that he would not enjoy the free expression rights that he has in the UK if he was extradited, and that, I think, was a scary proposition for the DOJ to be arguing a freedom of expression case that could affect all Europeans during an election period. So I think there was a little bit of a ticking clock there for the Department of Justice to sort this out, but the Australian government and their advocacy was key in this. And we've got to remember, Robbie, this was a guilty plea by Julian. He pled guilty to one charge under the Espionage Act in relation to his work, essentially to journalism. And so that is really chilling and should be really scary for all journalists around the world, because it's established this precedent that the US DOJ can now use the Espionage Act to go after publishers, to go after journalists who publish information that they don't like. And that is the first time that's ever happened. They tried to do it with the Pentagon Papers and failed. That precedent has now been wound back with this plea deal. So I think that's really, really scary. We'll be advocating really for a pardon for Julian very strongly now. Some of Julian's allies in the Congress, like Congressman McGovern, have called this deal out as very dangerous for journalists. So has Jamil Jaffer from the Knight First Amendment Institute. So there will be a real push now to secure a pardon for Julian and really unwind this precedent that's been set.
Yeah, absolutely. We will continue to talk about this case, to highlight the fact that a journalist was forced to plead guilty to espionage for simply sharing classified materials, publishing the way so many other journalistic outlets and organizations have done when they have information that they think the public ought to have a right to know. So there will be, I'm sure, continued discussions and advocacy on behalf of Julian, but it is nice to arrive at this moment where he is no longer in prison for his actions. So, Gabriel Shipton, thank you so much for joining us to discuss.
Thanks, guys.
So Some breaking news. The Supreme Court has released its decision in Murphy v. Missouri, also known as Missouri v. Biden. That's the social media jawboning case about whether the federal government violated the First Amendment when it encouraged social media sites to take down speech that was contrarian on COVID and some other subjects. So this was an important free speech case, and the Supreme Court has ruled 6-3 that the plaintiffs did not have standing to bring this case. In other words, this is a win for the federal government. The Supreme Court has allowed the federal government to continue to engage in the very behavior it did over the course of COVID-19 to instruct social media companies to take down content that the government didn't like. So this is a disappointing decision from my perspective and the perspective of many civil libertarians and progressive free speech defenders that we've had on the show. The decision was 6-3 with Amy Coney Barrett writing the majority opinion, and then the three dissenting justices were, you can probably guess, Alito, Thomas, and Gorsuch as well. So the majority didn't actually decide that the government's actions were permissible. Mm-hmm. They just declared that the plaintiffs did not have standing to bring this case. There's a very complicated, sort of legal situation under which you can bring a case against the federal government. You have to prove that you were harmed, and that there'll be you're under threat of a future harm, and that you're going to get relief actually by what you're asking for. And so there's a multi-part test that the majority said they didn't clear. So they didn't actually rule on whether the free speech claim was valid, just that the case was not legitimate for that reason. The other three justices disagreed. They said the plaintiffs did in fact show that they were harmed as a direct result of the government's action, and they also wrote in this decision that was authored by Clarence Thomas and joined by the two other justices that he thought the free speech violations were pretty vast.
Right. It calls into question if you're a consumer on social media's companies are businesses. And so by being a user on a social media website or platform or app, you are essentially a consumer of a product, and the exchange you're making is, you're viewing advertisements on the website. And so in that sense, the Supreme Court, I believe, is viewing this as these companies are businesses, and so them making decisions about who's a user on the website is their business decision.
Yes, that's an important distinction, because people will say this all the time. Oh, I'm being censored on Facebook. I'm being censored on Twitter. We can use the word censorship in a very colloquial way. Maybe I'm being censored if I'm kicked off Reason magazine. I don't work there anymore. Have they censored me? But they're a private employee and they can choose to work with whoever they want. Where the actual literal censorship comes in on the part from a First Amendment standpoint is the government can't order you to be fired from your job because of your views. So did the federal government in effect do that when they were sending all these messages that have been revealed as a part of the Twitter files? I delved into a lot of them for my own Facebook files installment, where I looked at all the emails between the Centers for Disease Control and Facebook, where content moderation was basically wholesale outsourced to the CDC. And the CDC wanted, posts, anything that could in any way contribute to what they termed vaccine hesitancy, they wanted taken down. Obviously, we saw a lot of pressure to take down things related to what the government says is election misinformation, including just joke posts, including, hey, Democrats, remember to vote on November 12th, not November, whatever the day is. Clearly satire, clearly jokes. Mm-hmm. And the federal government wanted that taken down as illegal election misinformation. Of course, the most infamous example of this is the Hunter Biden laptop story, which was suppressed on Facebook and Twitter. Because, as we've heard from Mark Zuckerberg and others, he'd had conversations with FBI agents where they warned that there was going to be this flood of Russian misinformation coming in. And Zuckerberg and others, feel, I think rightly so, that they got a lot of public blowback from conservatives. They got a lot of complaints that they were silencing conservatives when they're like, well, we were, the federal government was telling us to do this, and very explicitly. I mean, in some of these emails, it's quasi-threatening behavior from the government saying, if you don't do this, you're going to be responsible for the corruption of democracy. And by the way, we're going to go to a legislator and we're going to have you called before Congress to answer for this. And we're going to have a disfavorable profile about you written up in the mainstream media. Like it was really heavy pressure to do this. And so this case was determining whether that pressure would violate the First Amendment. The Fifth Circuit has said that it did, but now the Supreme Court is fundamentally not ruling on that question, so allowing it to be the same way that it was before.
It's a really concerning ruling because the Supreme Court has around 7,000 cases they can pick from a year. They review 100 to 150. So are the 9 justices each reading 7,000 cases or getting briefed on them? No, they have a lot of people who are their interns and their legal clerks. And these are typically people who are fresh out of law school, still in law school. They get this as sort of an internship deal. These are who are making recommendations about what cases are heard before the Supreme Court. That's concerning as a process. I think there's this common misconception that the court only hears cases where there's a clear constitutional violation of some sort or a constitutional question, and they always make it to the Supreme Court and they're always deciding on that, and there's very few of those cases. No, there are thousands of them. And for them to pick this case, to make this precise ruling, when there are so many cases of government censorship and government collusion with social media companies, it almost seems intentional that this court chose to hear this case where they could rule on a technicality and not really make a meaningful ruling about what this means for free speech. And that's really concerning. That's my takeaway from this case and this ruling.
And there are going to be profound, I would argue, negative consequences as a result of this ruling. Because this was being litigated, the federal government had actually decided to stop communicating with social media companies in the interim. They had massively backed off, putting their thumb on the scale and having the kind of interactions with social media companies that so many of us were frustrated about. This is basically a green light to continue that process. At least until a stronger case is brought, which I hope it is. So I have no doubt that more agencies, more comms people this was including comms people at the White House, the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. I mean, don't forget that President Biden, in the summer of 2021, got in front of a TV camera and said, Facebook is killing people. He said, they're killing people, with reference to Facebook, because they were not taking down enough COVID misinformation. Then Kate Bedingfield, who was at that time the White House Deputy Communications Director, or something, had some comms role in the White House, she went on TV and said, if they don't do more, they being the social media companies, to take down misinformation, we're going to look at Section 230, which is the federal statute that shields social media companies from some liability, that basically allows them to let you post at will. The reason social media companies, anyone can post on Twitter and Facebook, is because Facebook can't be sued if you say something libelous, something defamatory on social media. If you said something libelous about me, Jessica, I could sue you. You wrote it on Twitter. I couldn't sue Twitter. That's how Section 230 is structured, to make the internet possible. Because obviously, if the companies took on liability, then social media would just not operate this way at all. So the threat to take away this protection was a tremendous, powerful threat of adverse regulatory action aimed at the companies, unless they fell in line and did what the federal government wanted. And they did. And then they took down accounts like Alex Berenson, who was a prominent skeptic of vaccines. Martin Kulldorff, who was I believe affiliated with Harvard and was, again, would not describe himself as anti-vaccine, but had some questions about mandates and other COVID mitigation efforts. We've interviewed him on Rising before. That he was suppressed on social media as well. And the case was about whether the federal government pushing them to do that violated the First Amendment, and for now the answer is still no, which I think is really unfortunate.
And it's not like this was a lawsuit with a lack of evidence. It brought to light email communications between Andy Slavitt, the Biden advisor, in March of 2021.
So damning.
So damning. He was emailing with an executive at Facebook, Nick Clegg, who's a former British politician, and he expressed concerns about free speech if he were to take some of these videos down, what you alluded to. Some of them were memes about the COVID vaccine and a video of Tucker Carlson questioning the vaccine's effectiveness, not saying don't take the vaccine and here's why. It's not that it was harmful speech, simply questioning the vaccine.
Right.
And Clegg responded, I'm worried about free speech concerns. This is someone who's a former British politician who's now an executive at Facebook saying, I have free speech concerns around this, but instead what we're going to do to quell your concerns is demote the video so its traction is 50% less.
Yeah.
And so did the government say you have to do this by law? No, but did it influence executives? Certainly. And of course, those executives are worried that they're going to then be regulated or sued by the government if they don't comply, that there's going to be some kind of repercussions if they don't play ball. And so is it an official, legal thing that the government says you have to have this user take this down? No, but there's clear evidence that they coerce the executives to demote videos and remove videos based on their content.
Yeah.
And it wasn't favorable to the Biden administration. That seems to be the motivation there.
And there were also cases, we should mention, where the suppressed speech or the suppressed accounts, the rationale from the federal government was objectively wrong. On the Russian misinformation front, there were cases where the federal government, where FBI agents or federal bureaucrats told Twitter to moderate accounts, saying these accounts are Russian propaganda accounts, or they're fake, they're Russian bot accounts. And Twitter looked into it internally and was like, these are real people. These are Americans. These are not Russian bot accounts. Now you're asking for moderation, asking in special little quotation marks, asking us to take action against American accounts expressing legitimate political opinions on a false basis that these are bots. So anyway, that's the ruling for now. I'm sure we'll continue to discuss it this week and next, perhaps with some of our favorite guests who are also very invested in this ruling. I have no doubt that there will be further legal action brought on this basis, but for now, jawboning back on the menu. More rising right after this.
Supporters of former President Trump are busy preparing to govern once again if he recaptures the White House in November. Perhaps no one's been working harder than Tom Jones of the conservative opposition group American Accountability Foundation. The aim is identifying federal employees who might thwart Trump's policies. The Heritage Foundation has poured $100 grand into AAF's coffers to bolster its mission to amass a list of names of people working in the government who could potentially try to thwart a second-term Trump agenda, reports the Associated Press. Starting with the Department of Homeland Security, the group is digging into backgrounds, social media posts, and commentary of the employees. The ultimate goal is to publicly post 100 names of these individuals online this summer. Here to elaborate is Tom Jones himself, who helped found AAF. Welcome, Tom.
Hey, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
So, Tom, I have to be honest, this bears a striking resemblance to the McCarthy era to me, assembling a list of names, deeming them anti-American, simply because they don't have the same agenda as Donald Trump, but are federal employees. Do you see the comparison here that many people are making from the 1950s McCarthy era?
Yeah, look, if I haven't been called a racist, a Nazi, and the second coming of Joe McCarthy by lunchtime on Monday, I'm probably not doing my job. This is the typical approach of the left of they're going to throw some slur at you and expect you to go crawl into the corner, cry in fear, and get out of the public space. We're just not going to do that. But look, what this is about is ensuring that the people who are responsible for implementing the agenda of the duly elected president are not openly hostile to the agenda. And look, this isn't speculation. I've spent the last 2 months talking to people who served in the last administration. This is exactly what happened at the Department of Homeland Security. You had career civil servants who decided that they wanted to substitute their judgment for the judgment of the elected leadership of the country. And look, I can't think of anything more anti-democratic than saying, look, some career bureaucrat in the Department of Homeland Security knows better than the 300 million Americans who voted for a president. So look, we're here to educate the next administration about who's in this agency and who can be counted on to implement an agenda that's going to close the southern border.
Right. I think it's helpful for people to understand or to learn about how much of government policy is actually now outside the purview of the elected representatives who, yes, are, that changes hands every 2 or 4 years. Those people go in front of TV, they talk a lot, they're more entertainers than anything else, while government policy is being made by federal bureaucrats that many of them stay in their roles regardless of who comes into Washington, and many of whom, conservatives like yourself think, have an ideology that is progressive at its heart and that is antithetical to Donald Trump. So help me understand what you're identifying, based on their social media posts, perhaps what their thinking is. I mean, look, I don't think somebody should lose their job in the Department of Homeland Security or anywhere else just because they made fun of Trump or something. I mean, that would be a ridiculous waste of resources. But if they are talking openly about, wanting to find workarounds to continue pursuing policies that have fallen out of that the new administration is against, is that the kind of thing that's being called out?
Yeah, so I think it's important to kind of distinguish groups of folks here. What we are concerned with are policymaking individuals. Look, I don't care about the guy who's filling potholes on I-65 down here in Kentucky. That's not what I'm concerned about. What we're concerned about are the people who have essentially been given carte blanche to implement and obstruct an agenda from a policymaking perspective. They're not objective ball strike callers. They're not plumbers. These are policymaking individuals. And look, if you want to make policy, you need to run for office. If you want to implement policy and follow on what the elected leadership of the country does, then that's great. But look, it's just not what's happening. Kind of the 3 most dangerous words in federal lawmaking are the secretary shall, because that means that a broad swath of people who you've never heard of get to decide what laws actually mean. And it's an incredibly powerful ability. And what we're looking to say is, look, you're hired. Biden has hired people in the Department of Homeland Security who come from left-wing immigration advocacy agencies, and the idea that on January 22nd, if Trump would win, that they're going to go, you know what, I've dedicated my life to being an advocate for refugees, but you know what I'm going to do now? I'm going to salute smartly and implement a mass deportation plan because that's what the American people said they wanted. If you think that's what's going to happen, I think that's just crazy talk. Like, that's not what's going to happen. They're going to get up every morning and work to frustrate that agenda. And I think that is exactly why the left is so concerned and shocked by what we're doing, because they know there's a possibility that their people inside these agencies aren't going to have the sway that they used to have, because we're going to identify who these people are, and their objectivity is going to be called into question because they're not objective.
Tom, I'm a member of the left, and I can speak to what the left thinks on this, and it's not that. My concerns come from this bearing resemblance to the McCarthy era. I didn't call you a Nazi or a racist. I'm concerned because this was an era where it was an administration persecuting those who disagreed with its values. We live in a country where freedom is one of the most fundamental ideals: freedom of speech, freedom of political thought. What's the purpose of this list? What do you plan to do with these 100 names? Is it intimidation so that they resign? We are in an administration now where Jerome Powell was appointed to the position by, Donald Trump. He's still continuing to serve. We have members serving in government that come from either sides of the aisle, all over the political spectrum, and they're there to do a job. That's been a reality for many administrations. Why do you believe that you should publish this list of people who might be bad for the MAGA agenda because they simply have different political ideas? What's the purpose?
Well, look, it's not because they simply have different political ideas. It's because they have a history of using their influence within the federal government to thwart the agenda of the elected leadership. Like, that's what this is about. This is about saying, look, we're going to have a presidential election. The American people are going to decide. The overarching question is going to be about the southern border. That is going to be the top issue, followed closely by inflation. But the number one issue is going to be immigration, and it's going to be a stark contrast. If the American people say, look, we want to close the southern border because every community in America has been plagued by fentanyl and crime, and it's having a huge impact on entry-level jobs, and we need to have mass deportations to affect that change, then they deserve that, because that's how democracy works. So we can't have a cadre of unknown bureaucrats who are going to get up every morning and say, look, here's what we're going to do. We're going to slow roll this. We're going to come up with some bogus legal mumbo jumbo to say that we can't implement this agenda and come back to us in 3 weeks and we'll get you a memo. And they do it over and over again. That's exactly what they did with refugee policy in the first administration. Exactly what they did with the border wall is they slow walked this and they kept the president from implementing his agenda. So look, this is about democracy working its will. And I think the American people are going to speak. And if they speak and they say, look, we want the border closed, they need a team that's going to do that and not a team that is openly hostile to implementing that agenda.
Right, and that goes both ways. I mean, if Joe Biden is reelected, we know what the policies we're going to get are. We're going to get, continued robust FTC action, continued priority of funding of Ukraine. We're going to get, maybe different education department policies related to Title IX and other things, being made at the administrative level with in some accordance with the wishes of the president. That's if he wins the election. I fully expect that will happen. I'll be opposed to a lot of those policies, but that's how elections work. Whereas if Donald Trump wins, there will be a different set of policies and they will work. And I think many conservatives are wondering if a second Trump administration would actually work more efficiently at changing the policies of the government to reflect the policies that Republican voters are choosing. That is a criticism of Trump and his team the first time around, that that so much of what has been termed the administrative state, the operatings of the state, seem to function just the way they did before. So is there faith that this can be significantly altered even if Donald Trump wins?
Well, look, this is part of that process. I think you hit the nail on the head, is that there is this administrative state that has an inertia that is incredibly difficult to change, and it's overwhelmingly liberal. Like, if Joe Biden were to win re-election, he's not going to have any problem getting the civil service to implement his agenda because, by and large, the civil service is aligned with him. That's why you see the civil service unions coming out objecting to what we're doing, because they want to protect their friends in government. Look, this is part of, again, telling the administration who it is, what their biases are, and making them aware so that they can execute effectively. Look, the process for getting the senior leadership into these agencies is incredibly burdensome. President gets elected, he's not going to get his sub-cabinet people through the nomination process for months. It could be 10 months before he gets people in. What happens at that point is an acting from the civil service comes up and fills that role in an acting position. We need to know who those people are, because I think there's a pretty decent chance that they're not going to execute on the president's agenda, but they're going to be filling in an acting role for 10 months in this job. I think that's just unacceptable.
Well, I'm critical of bureaucracy, Tom. I think that I'm concerned that a lot of these federal agencies are governed by legislation passed in Congress. Congress has the final say. And in the Constitution, we have clear branches of government outlined so that we have the separation of power, and we can never have an administration that dictates policy in every part of our government. That's something that prevents us from having the kind of king that we had, that we fought the Revolutionary War over. And I'm considering the possibility that some of the names on this list will be people working in those agencies governed by Congress, not subject to the administration's agenda, Trump's decree. So will any of the names on this list, can you tell us, will any of them be folks who work in these agencies regulated by Congress and not directly by the executive branch?
Well, and what I can tell you is we're working on immigration policy right now, and the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice are kind of the two points that we're focusing on right now for this issue, because it's, again, as I said before, the most important issue facing Americans right now. So, Congress should do a lot to rein in these agencies, and that's a failing. I don't disagree that Congress hasn't done its job effectively and hasn't engaged enough in reining in the administrative state. Look, there's too many federal agencies doing too much, interfering in too many Americans' lives. And that's evidenced through the 2.2 million civil servants that we have inserting themselves in the lives of Americans every day. So, I think there should be a smaller, leaner government. But I think the government that we're stuck with should be a government that executes on the agenda of the elected leaders.
Well, then shouldn't the voters elect officials to Congress, representatives to Congress, who can make those changes?
Well, I think what they're going to do is they're going to elect a president who runs the executive branch. And if that president says, I want to close the southern border because that's what I campaigned on, the administration, the civil servants should salute smartly and implement that agenda. My point is, and the stories I've been hearing from everyone I've talked to about this, is that they just don't do that. they come up with ways to stall, to block, to prevent the agencies from implementing, to run the clock out on this. And that's what they did during the last administration. And if they're given carte blanche again, that's what they'll do in the next administration if President Trump's elected. So, part of our goal is to make sure that the single leader that we have in this country, who the Americans vote for, can implement his agenda.
But Trump wouldn't be the single leader in the country. They elect members of Congress to represent them,
Right,
and
of course,
Congress
I understand
oversees the Department of Homeland Security and various federal agencies that manage immigration policy. They're responsible for immigration policy. And so I'm a little bit concerned that this is a power grab for the executive branch if Trump were to govern with, using his power to intimidate people to vacate their posts, essentially.
I think the argument I would make is that the executive branch has already seized so much control over so much policy that our, founders and our framers intended to leave to Congress. And unfortunately, Congress has totally, yielded its duty to make policy to the executive branch. And so, yes, when you vote for the president now, you're voting for an entire agenda where it should have been more delineated by the different branches and by your representatives.
Yeah, and this is particularly pronounced when we live in an era of continuing resolutions when essentially the U.S. government is just on autopilot. 85% of the agencies aren't reauthorized on a regular basis, so the amount of oversight that's coming from Congress is negligible at best. So what you end up is the field is ceded to a bunch of people that we've never heard of. Like the Washington Post likes to lecture us on how democracy dies in darkness. You know what the darkest place in Washington is? It's the cubicle of the bureaucrat on the 6th floor of the Department of Homeland Security who's writing immigration policy, who no one knows who this guy is. That's where we need sunlight. That's where we need to understand who really has the reins over the United States government. And unfortunately, it's the administrative state right now. I wish it wasn't. I wish Congress was more assertive, but they're not. So I'm operating within the world I live in, and that is one where our executive branch has tremendous power.
Tom, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
T-minus 1 day to go before the first presidential debate between Joe Biden and Donald Trump this year. All eyes will be on each man, and with so much material to pull from, including age, mental fitness, criminal convictions, paying off porn stars, tomorrow's showdown will surely not disappoint.
There's obviously a lot at stake for President Biden and former President Trump, who are neck and neck in the polls nationally. Biden continues preparing in Camp David in Maryland. Trump is continuing to blast Biden. Here to give us a preview of what to expect tomorrow's throwdown is Leland Vittert, Washington chief anchor for News Nation. Welcome to the program, Leland.
Hey, well, thank you. Good to be here.
Great to have you. So obviously, we're tremendously excited for the main event tomorrow. What will you be looking for once the debate gets underway?
If there's a clear moment, right? And we can all political nerds go back and remember the knockout moments. Gerald Ford, when he said the Soviet Union didn't control Eastern Europe. That was a self-delivered, self-inflicted wound. Then you've got Ronald Reagan in 80. Are you better off than you were 4 years ago? 84. I'm not going to make age in my opponent's youth and inexperience an issue of this campaign, said Ronald Reagan. It ended the age issue then and there. You could see it in Mondale's face. He knew he had lost. Bernie Shaw to Michael Dukakis about what happens if Mrs. Dukakis had gotten raped and murdered. Would you support the death penalty? If, I would say, Robbie, at the end of the debate, we have to ask who won, then the debate really didn't matter, in the sense that if there's not an obvious and clear answer, then we just kind of incrementally move on.
So do you see the result of this debate potentially being one we've seen in the past, where actually both candidates are worse off afterwards because people tune in and they realize they're actually quite sick of both Joe Biden and Donald Trump?
Yes, and ... where do they go? The answer would be RFK, I think, is what you're possibly getting at. And they would give RFK a second look. The problem for RFK is that he got a look about 6 months ago. He sort of caught fire even last summer. There was this sort of interesting thing of who is this guy, and people gave him a look. There was a town hall on News Nation, and the problem for RFK was people got to know him, they got to hear his views, and he was unable to grow his base of support, and in fact, it is shrunk.
Yeah, it's somewhere in the, I think, 10%, 12%, depending on who exactly is being polled, which, still is a significant chunk of support in terms of
I would say, Robbie,
third party.
10 or 12% would be a very generous number.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. So what do you think about the debate format? We've been told there's no audience, that I think there's going to be a preset time that each candidate is talking, and then their mics go off. Obviously, I've seen conservative media spending a lot of time this week going after Jake Tapper and Dana Bash, the moderators, bringing up all the times they were perceived to be hostile toward Trump in the past. So there's a lot of already conservative CNN animus type things. The format, if Trump's not able to kind of cut in and interrupt Biden, could that hurt him or maybe that helps him?
We'll see.
Yeah.
The amount that Donald Trump gave away when he said, "I'll do it anytime, anywhere, any rules, anything," you got to be careful when you make those challenges, because the Biden administration, with the help of CNN and ABC, put him in a box with rules that were incredibly favorable to Joe Biden. I think, Jessica, maybe to your point, one of the things that's going to be striking, and we've gone back and watched an awful lot of tape of Donald Trump in 2016 with Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump and Joe Biden in 2020. Looking at the difference between those two men 4 years apart, or in the case of Donald Trump, 8 years apart, it is stunning how much they've aged and how much they've lost, just in terms of their vigor, their vitality, their ability to think on their feet. The difference in that tape is going to be, I think, something the American people will see. And when we play clips back to back from different years, that's perhaps a split screen that neither campaign wants.
On the one hand, you have Donald Trump, who in past debates has had witty responses, has sort of been willing to say anything, isn't as filtered as the typical political candidate. But we've also seen him in rallies recently kind of rambling on, making statements that make limited sense. We know he's on the campaign trail at rallies. He spoke about Biden's preparation, saying he's holed away, just practicing with his team, almost talking about him preparing for the debate as if it's cheating or as if that means he's being dishonest in his talking points. But I do think people are a bit sick of Trump's rambling, a bit sick of Joe Biden's prepared, polished talking points. What do you make of their preparation for the debate? How do you think it's going to affect their performance?
It's pretty fitting for both men, right? Donald Trump doesn't think he needs to prepare, and he goes out, and Trump is Trump. And we've seen different versions of Trump. And what you're hearing out of the both camps is Joe Biden is preparing on policy, and Donald Trump is preparing on style. And from a style standpoint, I think you're seeing an enormous effort by those who surround Trump. We have an interview tonight, Wednesday night, with Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, among many who are saying to Trump, please be normal Trump. Please be the guy who comes out and talks about policy and talks about inflation and talks about immigration and talks about crime, talks about policy and things that matter to the American people, not your own personal grievances and not rambling into discussions, like you said, about sharks and electric boats. That is going to be a real challenge for Donald Trump, especially when you know that Joe Biden is preparing for how to goad him on January 6th and how to goad him on winning the 2020 election. How those two issues are handled and whether Trump can keep his cool and play the long game and not talk about 2020 and relitigate that and not talk about pardoning the hostages of January 6th will, I think, have the most potential, those moments, to quote, to make news and be the moment.
I think there are some signs, at least lately, that Trump has been employing self-discipline in terms of his messaging, particularly to the business community, meeting with a lot of top business leaders lately to reassure them that, he's committed to implementing the kind of economic tax policies that they want. He even talked on, I think, that All In podcast for very top Silicon Valley tech people about more of a kind of immigration system for high-skilled people to be able to come in and work here. He seems to be trying to send the reassuring signals to the kind of people he needs, people who support some conservative, particularly economic policies, but were uncomfortable with Trump because of a lot of the personal behavior, that he gets it. So to your point, if we see that side of him in the debate, that's got to be who, his advisors are urging him to be that person, I would think.
100%. They all want him to be normal Trump. And normal Trump can be charming and entertaining and funny, but not mean and not sort of going off on tangents either about sharks and electric boats, which he did at one rally, or going off into the really visceral personal attacks, or, and I think this is a real fear, of the moderators asking what is a fair question: who won the 2020 election? And Trump saying, well, I did. Yeah. That is, I think, a real fear inside Trump world of getting into some kind of relitigation of that, or allowing Joe Biden to push him and let Trump get angry about January 6th and mouth off in that sense. And that's something that would really turn off a lot of voters in the middle. The small, persuadable middle doesn't like that side or version of Donald Trump.
And the fear for Team Biden has to be that he just loses his train of thought, that he confuses world leaders, he engages in some of the verbal issues he's had at press conferences recently that really alarm people, including many Democrats who might otherwise like his policies, that he just does not have 4 years left in him, no way, no how.
Fair, very, very fair. Joe Biden has the most to lose here, but he also has the most to gain. Because if Biden can put that issue to bed, that does a couple things. It ends the discussion about replacing him on the ticket. It perhaps gives confidence for the first time. People are going to be watching in a different way. We're talking about 80 to 100 million people watching this. That's a different forum than who watch. Robbie, like you and I do, the press conferences, as rare as they are, that Joe Biden gives when he's overseas, or some of his other remarks and moments and interactions with the press. A big majority of the American electorate is watching on Thursday night. That makes the stakes very, very, very high.
Leland, I appreciate how much the sharks and electric boats rambling has caught your imagination. It's caught mine as well. Something else that's on my mind is Project 2025. Now, I think a lot of people like us who pay very close attention to politics are paying attention to the Project 2025 rhetoric. I'm curious if you predict this will make it to the main stage during the debate, maybe not by name, but an indication that there's some rumbling in the Trump camp that the drain the swamp rhetoric might become real in a very McCarthy-ish way, where we just interviewed Tom Jones with the AAF. They're talking about making a list of anti-American federal employees. A lot of the ramping up around Project 2025 and this sort of draining of the swamp, really attacking the bureaucracy, which to me sounds like a huge power grab of the executive branch. I'm very afraid of a Trump presidency that will result in that. Do you think we'll get any indication? Maybe it will be brought up by Biden himself, maybe any indication that it's real from the Trump camp. I'm curious to your prediction if we're going to see any of this narrative come out Thursday night.
You're going to certainly see an attempt to draw Donald Trump into it. I think you make a great point, Jessica. It's something that Joe Biden flirts around, and we've heard from the White House or from the campaign that Biden is focused on attacking Donald Trump and painting this picture of what a Donald Trump presidency looks like in the worst possible ways, which I think would speak to what you're talking about some type of enemies list, or the groups that have gotten together for the transition of who they're going to try to pull out and try to compare that. You compared it back to McCarthyism. I'm not sure that's quite fair, but be that as it may, it's going to be a point that's brought up. And I think you're also going to see it from the moderators who are going to bring these kinds of issues up for Donald Trump. And you could almost imagine in the same way in 2020, Donald Trump was asked in that moment with Chris Wallace to disavow white supremacy and Proud Boys and everything else, and it kept going back and forth with Wallace. You could almost imagine sort of the same playbook from either Jake Tapper or Dana Bash to try and get Trump to commit in some way to not doing something or to disavow some group that would be, in a drain the swamp mode or like. And it's very difficult always for Donald Trump to criticize anybody who supports him or criticize anybody who he thinks can help him or a group. And so you could imagine that a similar kind of moment.
Leland Vittert, thank you for helping us break that down. We're looking forward to the debate tomorrow. Thanks for joining us.
Good to see you.
The squad just got a little bit smaller, with House Progressive Squad member Jamaal Bowman losing his primary race last night. This deals a major blow to the left wing of the Democratic Party. Bowman, who infamously set off a fire alarm, allegedly, some people say, to delay a vote, though he had denied that aspect of it, faced a steep climb heading into Tuesday's vote. The race had gained widespread national attention as a test of the Democratic divisions over the Israel-Hamas war. Now, George Latimer, who ousted Bowman, criticized the squad member for voting against providing additional aid to Israel and for calling reports of sexual violence during October 7th, quote, propaganda and lies, for which Bowman later apologized. The race was the most expensive House primary in U.S. history.
And it was interesting to see how differently media organizations reported this news. The New York Post cover read, quote, firing squad, anti-Israel Jamaal Bowman of AOC's Progress Caucus gets kicked out of Congress. While the New York Times headline read, quote, Bowman falls in House primary overtaken by flood of pro-Israel money. Others also weighed in on the Bowman race. Former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo tweeted ahead of the vote, Bowman should pull the fire alarm again because he's going to be smoked by Latimer. The message is clear. Anti-Semitism in any and all forms will not be tolerated in New York. And you can't call yourself a progressive without making progress. Actress Cynthia Nixon expressed her disappointment, tweeting, Bowman is the last Congress person of color in a New York district, not wholly in New York City. And let's be clear, the record $20 million spent against him did not come from Democrats in this Democratic primary, but from anti-abortion, anti-climate, anti-worker, far-right Republicans. You do the math. In another primary news, it was also a rough night for former President Trump and his endorsements. Trump-backed Colorado State GOP Chair Dave Williams lost his primary by over 30 points. Williams drew criticism after sending out a mass email this month in which he described, quote, LGBTQ plus people as godless groomers. Trump had also endorsed a replacement for Senator Mitt Romney. Instead, voters opted for a Trump skeptic, and it didn't end there. Trump backed a South Carolina pastor that also narrowly lost. Reacting to the results, Semaphore journalist David Weigel tweeted, quote, this might be the worst primary night for Trump-endorsed GOP candidates all year.
And Lauren Boebert did survive in her race, and she had moved to a different district that she thought would be more amenable to her victory, and that was correct. She remains in Congress. So Bowman, obviously the elephant in the room is the massive spending that AIPAC, the Israel lobby, they spent against him in that race. Although I did, after doing some research yesterday, it does seem to me that Bowman was already behind in the polling even before AIPAC started spending money against him. So it's possible that while this is now becoming a referendum on how much influence the pro-Israel forces have in the campaigns, and very specifically about how vocally pro the Palestine side against the Israel side of things Bowman has been, it looks to me like he very well might have lost before any of this happened.
Yes, interesting that comment from, not David Weigel, from Semaphore.
Yeah.
It's not personal whenever I mispronounce people's names, by the way. When I was doing a spelling test in second grade, my sister was helping me, and she's like, say this word. And I said, aggravate. And she said, say it again. And I was like, that's what it says. I don't know what that means. And she said, aggravate. I'm like, oh, I know that word. So it's always been a thing with me. But yeah, I think Trump having a historic night, not doing so well with his endorsed candidates, what does it mean for Trump Trump 2024? Anything? I think people vote a little bit differently down ballot than they vote in a big presidential race, so I'm not sure if that means a lot. I also don't think Bowman's loss means a lot for the growth we've seen in progressive movements across the United States. I don't think we can really say that a race where that much money from the outside came in is one that was decided by the people in that district.
But I don't mean to cut you off, sorry. Don't you, when a progressive, a squad type person, an AOC, enters, primaries a more establishment, better funded person and wins, right? That's an example of how, the left can overcome all the spending that the centrists get, but then sometimes it just doesn't work out that way.
Well, AOC didn't win that race, with a ton of money. She won that race because she was organizing, she was on the ground, but she wasn't combating a huge, $20 million on the other side or attack ads of that scale. She was kind of written off as this, fringe candidate that likely wouldn't win. And so they didn't run against her pretty hard. So I don't know if they're comparable.
Okay. I mean, she was up against, a very senior member of the Democratic House caucus, a very well-known figure, but I don't remember the amount of money spent was certainly less than the amount spent in this campaign. There was more spent in this campaign than any other in-house elections history.
It's insane that amount of money was spent in a single race. I mean, Nina Turner was, talked about after her race against Shontel Brown that this was a race that was determined by AIPAC money. That was $2 million. I mean, this is a magnitude greater than that. And Jamaal Bowman's someone who did go on a trip, like many members of Congress do, to Israel and was struck by the apartheid that he saw. He said, so Palestinian people or people who are Arab can't come in this area, but if you're, a Jewish Israeli person, you can. Certain Palestinians cannot, or certain highways are ones that Palestinians cannot drive on. You have to show your identification. You're subject to persecution at checkpoints. You can't freely move through this territory. And so upon seeing the apartheid state that exists there, he really shaped his mind in a way that a lot of people do the opposite. They go there and they're like, oh, we saw Israel, it's very beautiful. What a great thing that they have this country now. And, a lot of World War II sentiments end up getting, played into this rather than dealing with the reality of the situation there and visiting the occupied territories as well. I respect that Bowman did go on the trip and see what was happening there for himself, but made up his mind in the other direction. And I think even someone like Bowman, making the case and losing, it's still good that he didn't give up. He didn't say, oh, well, it looks like I'm going to lose. I'm going to change my opinion here. Because we have seen a lot of politicians cling on to their careers and abandon values that they initially ran on or held in their first years serving and representing the people of their district. So I appreciate that as his district changed, as the race changed, as politics changed in the country, he stuck to his values.
Yeah, it's admirable, obviously, to stick to one's values. Of course, there's a conflict between sticking to one's values and representing, the views of the district you represent. It seems like his views are are not representative enough. His views are not. He's not representing the views of the district. He's maybe too left or too anti-Israel for the people. Obviously, there is a significant Jewish population. Not that all Jewish people, I know, don't correct me. I know, don't necessarily support Israel or think what's going on is ideal. But I think sticking to your principles is in general a good thing. But, in cases where, elected leaders have to stick to what the people who put them in power want, or they're just not going to be in office very long. I think sticking to your principles is good if you're a political figure when I agree with your principles. And when your principles are not good, then you should reflect the views of the district if I think those views are better. So it's just an entirely self-serving agenda.
Yeah, I grew up 20 minutes from the border of Bowman's district, maybe even less, maybe close to 15 or 10. And Westchester County is very different from the Bronx. The White Plains and the Bronx are very different areas. And so it's interesting to me that this district that lumps in a group of people in the Bronx, it's almost intentional that you're taking a huge part outside of New York City, and it really dilutes the votes of those people in the Bronx. I think we have to do better in drawing these districts. There has to be a more fair process than this sort of political jockeying and power grabs the legislator and confirming these maps also. There are so many challenges, and that makes it extremely difficult to organize around an election where the landscape's constantly changing. In a neighborhood you might have knocked doors in a week ago, suddenly the district changes. And I've talked to a lot of organizers on the ground that try and engage voters in New York 16, and that was a huge challenge in 2022 and then again in 2024. And so I think that Bowman, in losing this race, it can't be credited to, the people he represents changed their mind on him as a person, because I don't think they got to see enough of Jamaal Bowman. I think they got to see the attack ads that George Latimer's 14.5 plus, now it's $20 million paid for about Jamaal Bowman. They got to see, Jamaal Bowman painted as this terrible guy while Latimer got his message out and said, I'm so much better. And when you get all of that misinformation, and some of it's a part of the political process, but when the volume is so much greater because they can afford to purchase more attack ads and flyers, you don't really have a fair race. And if you only hear from one candidate and not so much the other, are voters really making a decision with all of the information that's out there when they get to the polls?
Well, hold on. Is it really misinformation? I mean, they were calling to attention true facts about Bowman, that he does have a very anti-Israel sort of viewpoints, that he doesn't want continued funding for Israel from the U.S. And I'm not even criticizing that. With that point of view, I agree with. They called to attention some, I think, radical accounts he followed. Again, you can think the implications of that should not be taken seriously. I didn't think there was anything wrong with that, but it was not misinformation. They weren't portraying him wrongly or incorrectly. They were just letting people know things that might have made them uncomfortable about Bowman. I don't think that's misinformation. I mean, I don't think the entire concept of misinformation has much validity. But
they misquoted
they were telling
him
you negative things about him that were going to make voters uncomfortable, but they were true things.
They said he attacks his voters, he lies about them. They spliced up a New York Times quote he gave and said, everyone in my district completely dehumanized the Palestinians. These are two separate statements that they stitched together. They really made him out to be this person that he's not. Jamaal Bowman was organizing with Jewish Voice for peace. Obviously, he doesn't believe everyone in his district dehumanized the Palestinians. He organized for a ceasefire with people in his district. So taking statements out of context and making him seem like he's attacking voters and lying to them, which they directly said in some of these attack ads, I would say they're not giving voters an accurate idea of Jamaal Bowman. And if they get so many ads like this, I just don't think voters can make a fair decision when they get to the polls. And that's why having this amount of money in politics is a problem and a threat to our democracy, because you can really influence a lot with that amount of money.
By the way, apropos of absolutely nothing, earlier when you pointed to your hand, because I'm from Michigan, I thought you were going to show me where you live.
Hope
That's
College.
A Michigan thing
Yeah,
to say, like, I'm from Detroit, so this is where I grew up.
This is Westchester County.
Yeah, I don't understand New York geography
This is
at all.
Long Island.
I don't think it looks like a hand. More Rising, Reddit for this. New court documents reveal that the Biden administration health officials actually pressured international medical experts to nix the age minimum required to get gender reassignment surgeries. According to the New York Times expose, Assistant Secretary for Health at the Department of Health and Human Services, Rachel Levine, who is herself a transgender woman, requested the World Professional Association for Transgender Health to lower the age restriction. Her ask was granted. Age limits were eliminated from the final guidance on the standard of care for trans health.
Age requirements for adolescents seeking to undergo transgender-related care has become a hotly debated topic. According to 2021 draft guidelines, the Biden administration recommended lowering the age minimums to 14 for hormonal treatments, 15 for mastectomies, 16 for breast augmentation or facial surgeries, and 17 for genital surgeries or hysterectomies. Opponents argue teens are too young to make such drastic decisions, while supporters say implementing restrictions risk transgender individuals' mental health. So this recommendation from the Biden administration certainly comes after the recommendations from the organization of an international group. They make recommendations on transgender health care after reviewing the evidence. We don't have long-term evidence on the impacts of hormone blockers, but the doctors say that, having this person who is on, the hormone blockers go through puberty at the same time as their peers is something that can improve mental health. And it also has, a success rate that is great. A lot of people who, don't have the puberty of the gender they identify with oftentimes have a harder time with their body image later and acceptance in society as well.
I mean, that's the view of certainly some people, some activists, particularly in the transgender community. But European countries keep doing high-quality reviews of the scientific literature on whether these kinds of interventions, specifically puberty blockers, hormone replacement therapy, and they keep finding very little evidence that this ends up being in the kid's best interest. There have been reviews in Sweden, Finland, the UK, Norway. Again, European countries, not repressive, socially conservative religious dictatorships, keep looking at these procedures, these medical interventions very carefully and saying, you know what, there isn't a lot of evidence. This is improving life for these young people. So I think it's very interesting that the Biden administration, and led by a transgender woman herself, someone very activist on this issue, is pressing to lower the age limits at which young people can do this. And look, I want to be very clear. I don't want to stigmatize the transgender community at all. I don't have any problem with people. I mean, it's none of my business, so it doesn't matter if I do have a problem with it. But people should absolutely, in my view, be allowed to get access to medical care and to transition and to do whatever they want with their bodies. That's between you and your doctors. If you're a kid, it's also your family gets to consult here. So I have zero interest in involving the government more in people's medical decisions. We just went through COVID. I didn't like how involved they were in people's medical decisions on that front. However, looking at the new scientific evidence, I just want it to be evidence-based and fact-based and people to have all of the relevant facts as they're making these difficult decisions. And also, we do, as a society, we have decided that society gets to set some rules on what kind of behavior is acceptable for people under the age of 18 or under the age of 16, that there are some things that you, at that age, cannot consent to. And so, I think it's very interesting that the Biden administration is pushing for more ability for kids as young as 14 to go through experimental scientific procedures that European countries are finding suspect.
Well, I wouldn't say by reducing the minimum age requirement for hormone therapy, the Biden administration is pushing it. I would say they're making it available for parents who have access to this information. This was a decision based on a collection of all of the evidence we have after about 10 years of research. And it was a recommendation by an organization of health officials that specialize in transgender health care that said, we feel confident based on a review of the evidence and many studies that reducing the age to 14 is appropriate. Now, a big reason for this is because there have been some studies that show that puberty blockers affect, bone density in some of the kids that take them at an early age.
Fertility. There was some concerns about fertility.
And so having a transition happen instead of blocking puberty, receiving the hormones and the gender-affirming care, it could prevent some of that. So these regulations in some ways were actually encouraging children who identified as transgender, who were assessed by psychologists and doctors as really being mature in this cognitive decision, which is a part of the lengthy assessment that they go through with children to ensure that if they are not at the age of consent, typically for big medical treatments, for breast augmentations, it's 18 in many places as recommended by the FDA. But this, because puberty is something that you can't go back and change, a lot of these children were taking puberty blockers for maybe an unsafe amount of time or an unnecessary amount of time. And so allowing them to go through the hormone therapy after it's been demonstrated as safe as an option, I think is a good thing and a step forward in medicine. They're not pushing it upon kids, but they're making it available.
I mean, I hope they're not pushing it on kids. The contention of some people, including whistleblowers who have described what goes on in these kinds of clinics. There was someone writing for Barry Weiss's Free Press about this. The contention is that, and I've read the work of independent-minded liberal people like Jesse Singal and Katie Herzog, who have done a lot of writing on this too. The concern, the contention is that in some cases, you have a kid who has body image issues or doesn't fit in well or feels uncomfortable, who has other depression or psychological issues, a very common occurrence because being a kid and going through puberty is difficult for a lot of young people, that you have a model where too quickly and too easily that person is diagnosed as gender dysphoric, and then some kind of medical intervention that will change their body that could have a lasting impact is all too easily and quickly recommended and in fact pushed on the kid. I just want people, young people, and their families to be fully aware of what they are getting into with this kind of thing. And I also find it a little bit, fascinating at who gets mad about what involving kids. I'm not sure if we've had this argument before, but I've had this argument with other left people on the show with like kids, working jobs. Like there's some states have recently, Republican states have relaxed the child labor laws so that kids under 16 can take summer jobs or after school jobs or something. And this was described as this like huge assault on kids. I'm like, okay, if you can consent to have semi-permanent or permanent body-altering procedures, I think you can consent to like flip burgers at McDonald's. Like, are you an adult or are you not? And I think we need to work out some of those standards for, okay, this is when we have decided legally that you are in charge of your own decision making, and anything short of that does get regulated to some degree.
I think different cases are different, but I'm hesitant to trust the opinions or testimony of people working the front desk at a clinic, people working as a nurse at a clinic, people who are parents who witness things that other kids and their parents are going through, at these clinics or healthcare facilities. I trust the opinions of doctors on the issue. I don't trust the opinions of people who find the transgender community or LGBTQ plus community taboo, people who are against transgenderism altogether. I don't trust their opinions on transgender healthcare. I believe they're always going to be skewed by their belief that transgender people should not exist in our society, which a lot of people giving commentary on this, that is their position. I would rather look at what doctors are saying. And so Dr. Eli Coleman, who does have some experience treating transgender teens and their experience of puberty, whether or not they should be on puberty blockers or should receive this treatment. This is a doctor at the University of Minnesota Medical School's Human Sexuality Program. And, Eli said, certainly there are adolescents that do not have the emotional or cognitive maturity to make an informed decision. That's why we recommend a careful multidisciplinary assessment. So this belief that it's just a rash decision because a child one day says, why am I a boy? Why am I a girl? It's not like, well, let's get you to the doctor and get you your hormones. That's just not how this is happening. Doctors are making thorough assessments. Parents are hesitant to bring their kids in for something like this, I'm sure, because they know that the child might be bullied and there's a protectiveness there. But ultimately, I think it should be a decision between a doctor, a team of doctors, a parent after reviewing all of the research that's out there about this because they care for their kid, and the child, their parent, and their doctor only. I don't think that we should be looking to what people are writing about in blogs and think, they don't like it, maybe our kids shouldn't do it. I really think we should look to doctors for commentary on this.
I mean, I agree with you, but there are doctors, again, there are scientific studies. This is a headline from The Economist, not based on what random people on blogs think, but as the result of these scientific studies conducted in Europe, that the evidence to support medicalized gender transitions in adolescents is weak. It doesn't mean it's bad in every case. I absolutely accept and believe that some kids, we're talking about a small number of individuals in general, that some people are helped by having this kind of intervention early on. I absolutely accept that. I am not arguing against that at all. I'm just saying exactly what you said, that it has to be very rigorous. It has to be extremely psychologically determined that this is in the best interest of the child. This is what the person actually wants. This is what their family understands all the risks. And we should continue to study this and see what are the benefits and what are the side effects of it, And right now there's a kind of attitude that if you have any questions about this, any hesitancy whatsoever, you're a bigot. Certainly there's bigotry out there, but not all of the concerns, the desire for a degree of cautiousness as we advise these incredibly far-reaching, life-altering procedures, there ought to be just a little bit of care taken. That's all I'm saying. No, nothing against transgender people. It is helpful. I know transgender people who were well served by taking this option, and it should absolutely be available to them. We just want all the information available.
Well, the evidence around COVID was weak at the beginning around masking and social distancing. We didn't know how much of an effect that would have. And so, I don't know, Robbie,
now we
that
know it didn't
you
have much of an
believed
effect,
people
right?
should make their own decisions with
Yeah,
the
well, that's what I'm
information they
saying.
have. So reducing the age is just giving people the free choice to make that decision. It's not so different from the COVID health data and decision-making of the public then.
Well, sure. As I said to begin with, I have no desire to get the government more involved, and I am very skeptical of efforts undertaken by legislatures to make this illegal or to close it off. I don't want to tell other families what's best for them. That's really something for you to decide, and I wish more decisions were made on that basis. Unfortunately, we went through COVID and a time period where it was decided that no, at the highest levels of our government, you'll be forced to comply with what the established science was at the time. So some people would say, well, now that we've made that the norm, now suddenly you want to say that it's people's right to choose this thing or not choose this thing. Again, I believed that all along, and I will continue to advocate for it. More Rising right after this. Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich went on, quote, trial in Russia today over a year after his arrest in the Russian city of Yekaterinburg. Now, he was arrested on espionage charges that he was gathering secret information for the United States, claims that both he and the Wall Street Journal fervently deny. Gershkovich is the first Western journalist arrested on espionage charges since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. Russian prosecutors said earlier this month that Gershkovich had collected secret information about a military factory in Russia while on assignment from the CIA. But no evidence, none whatsoever, has been shared publicly. Now, the State Department has declared him wrongfully detained, says it is committed to seeking his release. Wall Street Journal publisher Almar Latour and top editor Emma Tucker said in a statement, Evans' wrongful detention continues to be a devastating assault on his freedom and his work, an unfathomable attack on the free press. Now, the trial took place behind closed doors, but journalists were allowed in the courtroom for a few minutes before the proceedings became closed. Gershkovich, who has already served 455 days behind bars, faces up to 20 years in prison if he's found guilty, according to the Associated Press. Russian courts convict more than 99% of the defendants who come before them, which is a very concerning statistic indeed. This is, deeply regrettable situation, absolutely wrong. Evan is unquestionably a victim of state tyranny. This is an attack on freedom of the press. I assume what's actually going on here is, the Kremlin is very involved in this prosecution. Vladimir Putin, like with the detention of Brittany Griner, is pursuing wants some kind of exchange or some diplomatic concession in order to eventually have Evan be freed. He's being used as a bargaining chip. This is not really, there's no legitimate, or no one has presented any legitimate evidence that espionage is going on. It's a very far-fetched idea anyway. So he is, suffering this fate while Putin is seeking some kind of better deal.
Yeah, I'm very curious to see what evidence is going to be brought before the court, but we won't because, of course, it's a closed trial. But, we don't know what's going on the ground in Russia. Of course, Navalny is someone that when he, was persecuted by Russia, the United States was like, this guy is a hero. Upon his death, he was memorialized as if he was a freedom fighter like Martin Luther King Jr. and the likes, Nelson Mandela, which was a bit ridiculous because this was someone who was participating in protests where there were Nazis present. I know you don't think people who are at protests with Nazis are Nazis, but this was someone who himself had a lot of speeches on the record into microphones saying extremely far-right things, calling the Muslim communities and people of color across Russia cockroaches. These are the Caucasus. And so he said some really insane things and was deliberately getting money from the U.S. government through the National Endowment of Democracy. There's records of him receiving these grants to engage in activism. And so is that collusion, CIA espionage?
Well, sure. I mean,
no.
But
if that happened in the U.S. would be pissed.
I don't have to agree with somebody's political views or every statement they've ever made in their life that might be offensive to think that they should not be unjustly arrested and then killed in prison by the government. Like, actually, if he was an outright Nazi, I wouldn't think the treatment, the arrest, the detention, the subsequent assassination of a political rival would be a good idea. I'm advocating civil liberties regardless of the ideology of the person. I don't want a greater confrontation with Russia. I think a lot of our Ukraine policy is wrong-headed. I don't think that's because the Russian government is good or something, or that I have any illusions about how the Russian government treats dissidents, how it's treating this journalist, Evan Gershkovich. Now, I think while we condemn Russia's treatment of these figures, we should also be self-reflective, and we should criticize the U.S. when it similarly falls well short of its lofty commitments to freedom of speech, including with the case of Julian Assange. We're speaking with his brother, Gabriel Shipton, today about Julian's release, which is finally, thank goodness, been coordinated. Julian had to plead guilty and will be on his way back to Australia. He's freed from prison. So we'll get to that a little bit later in the show. I think it's absolutely fair to criticize the U.S. government and the British government for their actions with respect to that. So many times, our Western governments, including Ukraine, which we're paying to defend, they suspended the free press. They suspended opposition parties. So yes, I agree with that. But it's not because I think West and U.S. bad, Russia good. It's that all governments should be viewed with a certain amount of skepticism, and Russia is clearly engaged in repression with respect to Navalny. Even if you don't like some of the things he said, and I don't know whether that's true or not. I haven't looked carefully into all of his past statements, but certainly in the case of Evan Gershkovich.
I don't believe, governments are good for persecuting these people, of course.
Right.
Anytime, the U.S. decides that they're going to crack down on a journalist, like Julian Assange is a perfect example, and also in the news right now, it's kind of rich how you have these perfect comparisons making headlines and people giving commentary in opposite directions without any consistency, that Julian Assange was somehow this horrible guy, but Gershkovich is being prosecuted and Russia's the worst. Right. You really have to have that consistency, and that's what I don't have a taste for, is that hypocrisy coming from so many people in the United States that just have different standards when it's the Russian government doing precisely what the U.S. government has done time and again. If it was the United States that had, an official Russian governmental agency listing grants that they gave to people who are political activists in Russia, people pushing different ideas politically during an election year, this happened during 2016, the United States would be in shambles. People would be having meltdowns. But when we do it to Russia, it's because we love democracy and we want everyone to have it. But when it's another country coming into the U.S., it's foreign intervention and it should never happen.
Well, I agree with that. But I'm also perfectly happy to state that the U.S. is more of a democracy than Russia is.
I think that's fair to say.
There's no comparison, right?
But I think the U.S. has specific interests of protecting their hegemon and protecting global capitalism when they engage in actions abroad. So we'll have, the story we covered last week, this was a really good radar from you, something I wasn't aware of, pushing vaccine misinformation abroad, making people question the Chinese vaccination during COVID-19, and it resulting in deaths abroad. Whereas at home, we're fighting vaccine disinformation so much so that another story we're covering today, the Supreme Court ruling about the U.S. government suppressing any questioning of the vaccine at home while we're pushing misinformation abroad. It's just such a double standard.
Yeah. Well, we will stay tuned for any developments in the Evan Gershkovich case. More Rising in just a minute. Former President Donald Trump is reportedly getting close to picking his VP. In fact, some reporting says he's already picked that VP. We're just waiting to find out who it is. Top contenders have included Governor Doug Burgum, Senator J.D. Vance, and Senator Marco Rubio, though several other names have also been floated, including Senator Tim Scott and even Vivek Ramaswamy. Now, the ladies on The View have had a lot to say about potential VP picks. Appearing on Fox News, let's watch.
The former Apprentice host is getting help from Fox News by letting the top contestants make their case on the network. Tim Scott and Doug Burgum, and they're slated to appear, and J.D. Vance kicked things off this morning. Take a look.
Was just a very, very good president. I would say a great president, right? And I think when you look at something and you say, look, this guy was successful. He brought freedom. He brought a ton of prosperity to our country, peace on the world stage, right? Like, you didn't have a new war popping up every year. So I just think the results were so good. How could anybody look at it and say, oh, yeah, I was critical of Trump in 2016, but he proved me wrong?
So is a reality TV competition style approach any way to pick a vice president? And what exactly... I mean, I don't even know. I didn't even get to that question. But what is he? What are they doing?
He's looking for who rates. So what he's going to do is he's going to roll them out in interviews, and he's not looking for skill. He's not looking for even maybe a policy stance. He's looking for who do people like? Where do the largest crowds come? Who do the most people watch? Because that's honestly what he needs.
So
It's like reality TV, Rami.
I mean, that's what politics is. So who cares? The VP choice, I've heard, has been made by Trump. It's unclear whether that person knows who it is yet, and we, the public, don't know who it is. But they will be attending the debate. As we said, the names that are in contention now seem to be Vance, Burgum, Rubio, Scott, and I have heard some things about Vivek Ramaswamy. I don't actually think he's going to pick Vivek. Each of these people have different strengths and weaknesses. There's someone like J.D. Vance, who is, I think, in some ways the most similar to Trump in terms of ideology. J.D. Vance, senator from Ohio, very much in the populist, national conservative tradition. Someone who was Trump skeptical initially, author of Hillbilly Elegy, was helping, I think, mainstream media figures understand why Trump was appealing without actually endorsing Trump, but has now come around to being one of the most full-throated pro-Trump people there is. I don't see what Trump really gains by picking him. Trump himself doesn't want to share the spotlight, and Vance is a very, he's on TV a lot, making the case. He's almost like too similar. Now obviously Tim Scott there's a very surface level diversity kind of argument. One that Republicans always say they're not going to do that, but then it's like, oh, look a woman Republican, look an African American Republican that might actually end up appealing to party leadership. So there could be that. I think, from my own standpoint, Doug Burgum has really become a dark horse in this field of potentials. He's the governor of North Dakota. Nobody knew who he was until he ran for president. He was one of the primary opponents of Donald Trump. He's a little bit more, I think, of an old school, traditional business Republican. He has really close ties to tech and to Silicon Valley. He's a very wealthy man. He sold his company, his tech company. I think those financial connections could really help the Trump campaign. As Trump right now seems most inclined. He wants to make peace with the business world. He wants to bring business people back into the fold. And I see a lot of evidence that he's been trying to do that in his recent communications with business people. I think Burgum would be another move to kind of solidify the support there. So I'm sort of, I don't know who he's going to pick, but I'm starting to come around to that as maybe the strongest option.
I think J.D. Vance, from the standpoint of like making good with the community of big business and financial technology, as well as finance, as well as tech, J.D. Vance is definitely a candidate who ticks that box. I mean, his election was thanks to Peter Thiel, who gave him more money than any person has given someone in a single race, $16 million. So to be backed by the PayPal mafia and to sort of run on this idea that he's someone that will stand up to big tech. He was getting paid by big tech to run, so I don't know that I'm super confident that that's his position. I do think that he is a candidate that has the kind of connections that Trump would want. And so I think J.D. Vance doesn't have the experience maybe to be a VP. He's pretty young. His political career is pretty new. But he does come with, a few shiny endorsements and some good friends and powerful friends.
Trump and Thiel have had a somewhat combative relationship. Obviously, Thiel was very supportive of Trump in 2016, supported him, spoke at the RNC. Thiel declined to get involved in assisting the re-election effort in 2020. That stung Trump very much. So we will see how it shapes up this time. You're right that Vance is connected to Thiel world. Thiel also spent a lot of money on Blake Masters' Senate run in Arizona in the midterms, and Masters narrowly lost. And that I think you see reporting periodically that Thiel's no longer interested in politics. He thinks this is a waste of money and time, and then he's interested again, and he's not interested in again. So we'll have to see. And then there's Vivek Ramaswamy would certainly make a lot of very online younger conservatives happy. He's the one on Twitter whose name comes up the most. I know there are a lot of fans of his who watch Rising because I read the comments and see what they have to say. So Trump could make certainly, I think, a younger, more online savvy conservative audience very happy with those, with that pick. That said, I don't think it's particularly likely, but it could happen.
I think Trump probably wants someone who's malleable, someone who will follow him and doesn't have other connections that would conflict with Trump's interests.
Well, that's
and I
Tim
think
Scott. Tim Scott seems totally malleable.
There are
to
people
me.
very willing to kiss Trump's feet, and I think Tim Scott would be the yes man that Trump would want. I mean, he's proven, I'm going to be your guy. I'll do whatever it takes to be VP. And so many people have been in embarrassing positions because of that. I mean, Ted Cruz, for one, he said his wife was, I believe, a dog about her appearance. Can you imagine Ted Cruz going to endorse Donald Trump after he called?
He did, and he will.
I know, and it's like these people just grovel to be in proximity to Donald Trump because they want the power. But I think what Trump's really looking at is who will be a yes man, but also who's going to get him attention.
Well, I mean, Kamala Harris, when she was running for president, basically called Joe Biden a racist. Remember that whole thing at the debate? And then she was picked to be vice president, and she was asked about that. She's like, oh, that's just politics. Who cares? So there's a long history of that. I think it's... I think a lot of presidential candidates don't want to be overshadowed by their Veep. That was certainly the case for Hillary Clinton when she picked the biggest non-entity of all time. I don't mean to insult our dear senator from Virginia, Tim Kaine, but this was a pretty forgettable person without a huge national profile. She did not want to be outshined whatsoever. I can see Trump making a similar calculation here. Trump is the star. But the VP could reassure some in the business community that there might be that behind all the Trump rhetoric that turns them off, there could be a steady hand at the wheel. So we will have to see how it shapes out. Hopefully we'll know very soon. More Rising right after this.
2 astronauts are stuck in space right now. The NASA astronauts Barry Bush Wilmore and Sunita Suni Williams are stuck on a spacecraft owned by, you guessed it, Boeing. The mission is part of NASA's Commercial Crew Program, which was testing to see if Boeing spacecrafts could be certified to perform routine missions to the International Space Station. The aircraft blasted off June 5th, and the original plan was to be in space for just 1 week. But a series of issues quickly derailed everything, including 5 helium leaks and 5 dead maneuvering thrusters. The target return date has been reset 3 separate times, and it's unclear if there's been a new date set. In a statement, NASA spokesman said, quote, Starliner is performing well in orbit while docked to the space station, and we are letting the data drive our decision-making relative to managing the small helium system leaks and thruster performance we observed during rendezvous and docking.
The 2 astronauts reportedly spent Tuesday making sure that the space plumbing works and have replaced a pressure control and pump assembly motor. In a bit of relief, the Starliner can stay docked for up to 72 days, relying on backup systems. So it's not dire as far as I can tell, and if they got to a point where it was dire, NASA and SpaceX could stage a rescue mission. They're not actually there at all yet. The timeline is, I'm reading this timeline from Fox Business, is that they blasted off. They left Earth on June 5th. They were scheduled to come back on June 26th, but that didn't work out. They're now July 6th is the target date. On July 20th, it would be 45 days since they left, and they have until September 30th before they would run out of the backup power. So not a reason to panic, although the Boeing angle is, I'm sure, going to have a lot of people raising their eyebrows given everything that has gone wrong with Boeing lately, the deaths of whistleblowers, all of that stuff.
Right. I'm sure there are Boeing whistleblowers that are just reeling seeing this. There might be Boeing whistleblowers who have been silenced, who may have something to say about the construction of this spacecraft intended.
Maybe the astronauts are Boeing whistleblowers, and
that's why they're stuck
that's why
up
the
there.
Thrusters failed conveniently.
Very conveniently.
Very conveniently.
But I think, there might be someone who has something to say about commercial space travel. Is it necessary? Why are government resources, if any, going towards this? Now,
you're one of these anti-space people, huh?
I just think that we
go
have
ahead, do your
problems
enemy of
at
progress
home.
spiel. Oh my God.
I mean, I appreciate
Yeah,
science.
our problems are that we don't have space colonies.
No.
That's the problem.
But how is sending rich people on joyrides to space furthering that scientific progress, Robbie?
Well, if people want to spend, if rich people want to spend their own money doing that, that's fine with me. I think private investment in the space industry is a glorious thing. I applaud Elon Musk and SpaceX and everything they're doing. Do I want to spend government, public resources on it? Absolutely not. But if they're doing it with their own resources, they're trying to get a commercial, private space industry, I think that's all to the good. That's where humanity is headed. We're gonna colonize the solar system. That's what we're gonna do.
We'll make this planet unlivable and find the next one.
We're gonna become a multi-planet species. That's how we will propagate and survive. I think it's glorious, and the drive to better understand the heavens, the stars, to look up to the sky has been a positive development for philosophy, for better understanding the human condition, and for scientific innovation. And I am all for it. I don't like this. Oh, there are problems at home attitude. I mean, there are problems at home, and they should be addressed. And again, I do not want our tax dollars going to this or really anything else. I would just give people back their tax dollars. So if it's a concern about public funds being spent on space fantasies, that I'm not for. But no, private investment in it is great.
I think so many of the space fantasy fiction that we have,
I'm listening.
There's not an aspect of these stories, not all of them. I mean, Red Rising's been a pretty good series. Pierce Brown does a good job depicting economic inequality and class divisions in his series there. But most of them, the vast majority, don't depict space travel as something that happens while people are on the planet starving. I think, Star Trek goes back in time and shows,
Star Trek is a progressive
and they're like,
fantasy
look at all of these people starving in the homeless camps before we sorted things out and made sure everyone was whole and had what they need, and then we could do space travel. I think having space travel happen and the amount of millions of dollars allocated towards it, when people don't have homes, when people can't make ends meet, it feels like our priorities are lost. Our economy is supposed to be something where people organize together to meet their material needs and their wants as a society. I think the needs should be the priority before the wants of space travel.
Oh, okay. I mean, global poverty is, everything's not perfect, but global poverty has dropped precipitously in the last 100 years. Things are, in terms of economic inequality, in terms of lifting people out of the third world, lifting people out of starvation. We've made tremendous progress. If you're going to say, well, we can't colonize space until we've made absolutely everything perfect on Earth, I think that's a self-defeatist and anti-progress attitude. Because the reality is, people will invest in or spend their money in whatever interests them. You can't centrally organize or control society and governments or societies that have tried to do this have tried to give central control to some authority body to redistribute the resources to make it more equal. Always and every time turn into authoritarian hellholes and dystopias with even more inequality, because human beings are fallible and no one can be solely trusted with the responsibility to allocate all of the resources. And when you have a committee try to do that, they end up self-enriching themselves, and you end up with even more starvation and even more
Well, that's what we
inequality.
already have. We're already in that situation where that committee has enriched themselves. Wealth inequality has increased tremendously, and while they've defined themselves out of a problem with the global poverty metric being $2.15 a day, that can't afford you rent or food in the United States of America. So by saying, this is the global poverty metric and look how much we've reduced poverty, but do those people have their basic needs met? You can't just put a dollar amount on the money they have and say, you're not poor anymore because you have $2.15 per day. Do they have a home? Do they have housing? And while you might want to say, well, people are more comfortable than they used to be thanks to technology and all of these things, with the wealth inequality we've seen, it feels wrong that some billionaires can start their own companies and go to space while some people can't even afford to make ends meet and keep a roof over their heads. Right, but it used to be that almost everyone could not afford to do that, and there was no one going to space. Now there's significant, it's not perfect, but there's significantly fewer people living in poverty and starving, and we have people going to space. That seems like a good thing. We can all be poor and miserable and starving and dying violently in ethnic and religious conflict as we were for hundreds and thousands of years, or we can have it now where there's still a lot of things to work out, but we're going to space. I don't mean to say everything is rosy because people don't like hearing that. There's still a lot of problems to work out, but sometimes we do have to take a minute to acknowledge that we've come a long way as a civilization, and we would not want to return to the Dark Ages or ancient times. Maybe in the long run, but in the past 50 years or so, we've seen wealth inequality in the United States exacerbated in extreme ways. Wealth inequality. Okay. And so you have people who now say they're worse off than their parents were in the 70s. Well, they could say that, but is that actually true? We've seen wages stagnant since the 70s, and when adjusted for inflation, the minimum wage currently is lower than it was worth then in terms of buying power, yes. Inequality has gone up because they're very, very wealthy people, but I don't actually care about that. I think wealthy people, if they're wealthier, if they're even more wealthier, that doesn't matter. What matters is the minimum standard improving for people. And in some ways it is, in some ways it's not. It's true that a lot of things are relatively more expensive, like healthcare and education. We have a massive housing shortage, but people did live even in the 60s and 70s, people lived in much smaller homes on average. They were less likely to have air conditioning. They had fewer cars per household. They had fewer TVs per household. Things have gotten directionally better on a lot of fronts, but some sectors, ironically the sectors that are most controlled and directed and subsidized by government, healthcare, education, housing, are the ones that have not improved dramatically. And I think there's maybe a lesson in that. I think those are things that people care about a lot, though. They are, housing and food. And some would say they care about those expenses the most, Robbie. Well, I care about those things too, but also space. That does it for us today on Rising. Great being with you today. Jessica, you'll be here again tomorrow because I know what day it is. Tomorrow is debate day. Tomorrow's debate day. It's going to be a big day. We're excited for that. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content, including our debate coverage. And for those of you who like to listen while you're on the go, we are available wherever you get your podcasts. See you tomorrow. Bye, y'all.